Ooh, this is mysterious. Okay. We're in Rome, right? We're in Rome, Italy. And the century we left off in was the 8th century. The 8th century BCE, which would be 3-digit numbers beginning with 7. In Rome, the Romans, who are not really yet the Romans, they're just the people who live in this area. The Romans had a story about themselves in that time, back in that shadowy past. And that story that they had, well, actually they had 2 stories. The earlier story, the first story that they had, involved these twins, Romulus and Remus, who were nursed by a she-wolf in the wild and discovered by a shepherd who raised them. And then when they grew to manhood, they moved out of the tiny town where they had been raised to this very strategic, very nice spot about 17 miles from the coast along a river called the Tiber, Tiber. And in this spot near the Tiber were 7 hills. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then a couple hills on the other side of the Tiber. And also in this spot there was an island which made for a more natural and easy crossing point. The hills were handy because up on top of a hill, your settlement can't be flooded, and also it's a little easier to defend, to protect. And indeed, there have been archaeological excavations that have recovered very early remains in this area. So the story goes that Romulus and his brother Remus settled, one on the Palatine, that would be Romulus, and one on the Esquiline, that would be Remus. And each was king of his own settlement. In the marshy area, prone to flooding, in between the Palatine and the Esquiline, archaeologists have recovered a big cemetery. The whole area was a cemetery. And in this area, which was already excavated in the 19th century, in the latter part of the 19th century, 2 kinds of burials have been found. What kind of burial? Well, okay, let's start with this one. It's easier. What kind of burial is this? Inhumation. Yes. An inhumation means the skeleton laid intact in a grave. And what kind of burial is this? Somebody in the back there? You lit up by the glow of your computer screen all the way in the back? So easy for me to spot you in the dark. What kind of burial is this? Thank you. Yes, a cremation. Because it has a little cinerary urn. So there are these 2 different types of burial side by side. And naturally, the earliest archaeologists who worked here in the 19th century saw this as archaeological testimony to the veracity of the early legends about Rome, that there was one settlement on the Palatine and one settlement on the Esquiline, and they used a common cemetery, but one of the peoples only had inhumations and one of the peoples only had cremations, because obviously the same people wouldn't bury in 2 completely different ways. And what this does is prove that there were these 2 separate settlements on the Palatine and the Esquiline, doesn't it? No. And how do you all know that that is not true? Derive some evidence from one of the sites you studied. I'm not calling on you guys. Somebody back there. It is really dark in here. Maybe we should turn... Hey, Dan, or somebody, maybe we should put at least a shade up towards the back, because I can't see on anybody to pick on you guys. That's not good. All you people in the back get a free ride that way. Oh yeah, this is a little bit better. Okay, thanks, that's good. All right, how do you know that that's not true? You with the hat on your head. Or what sites have we studied so far that would allow you to say, no, that's not necessarily the case because at Lefkon D, there were both kinds of burials. Where else? And Athens, right. So really it's just a matter of space, style, whatever, but because certainly not necessarily evidence that there are two completely separate peoples. But in any event, there are these two kinds of burials found down in the marshy area between the Palatine and the Esquiline. And as you have astutely deduced, they were cremation and inhumation burials. The cremation burials have these, many of them, quite adorable cinerary urns. Do you not love these? These are so darn cute. What do they look like? Yes, they look like houses. They are very adorable. And regularly, there are hundreds of these from the cremation burial in this marshy area, this early cemetery. And yes, they look like huts. So indeed, there is a settlement of well, at least there are people living in the area in the 9th and the 8th centuries, because the burials in this area between the Palatine and the Esquiline can be dated to that on the basis of their pottery. And you are going to be happy to learn that I am not going to force you to learn how to identify Iron Age Italic pottery styles, because they are much more boring than Iron Age Greek pottery styles with all their cute little circles and triangles. So we won't go into it. Suffice it to say, we can tell through the magic of archaeology that the date of the cemetery area here is the 9th and the 8th centuries BCE. So, of course, that's something you want to be writing on your notes so that you can be inserting it into your chart. Well, up here on the Palatine, in fact, evidence of a settlement has been found in the form of these wholly unlovely foundations. These foundations are for huts. So you see the perimeter sort of drainage area, and then they are cut directly out of the bedrock of the hill. And these would be holes for the posts that would hold up the huts. And here you see a reconstruction of what one of those huts would look like. And it's uncanny how similar it is to these hut-like cinerary urns from the cemetery. So there is this village up on the Palatine in the 9th and the 8th centuries BCE, and there's this hilarious old diorama of what it might have looked like. And that is a weird and fun coincidence, because the Romans didn't just have a story about the founder of Rome and his brother. They had a date. In fact, they were pretty specific about it, and they kept records, the Romans did. So this is a date that for us translates into April 21st, 753 BCE. This cracks me up, I must say. Anyway, what century is 753? 8th. How cool is that? All right. The Romans had two stories, not just one. Two stories makes you even better. They had two stories about their founding. And their second story hooked the Romans up with the biggest and best story that all peoples of the ancient Mediterranean world hooked themselves up to, and that was the story of Troy and the Trojan War. We know about the Greek side of the story, but there were heroes on the Trojan side too. And in the telling of the story in the Iliad, many of the Trojans wreak havoc on the Greek side, and many great Greek warriors die in battle at the hands of much more valiant or stronger Trojan warriors. So both sides were noble and kingly and strong and so on and so on. And one of those Trojan warriors was Aeneas. Aeneas, according to the Iliad. And the Romans believed, and had a story that eventually they wrote down in their own epic, much, much later, that from the ashes of the city of Troy, after the conquest by Agamemnon, or whoever this guy is, and his fellow Greeks, some of the Trojans fled their burning city and wended their way through the Mediterranean, and Aeneas was one of them. And Aeneas was not only valiant and not only brave, but he was pious, and he was reverent to his family. When Aeneas fled, he carried his aged father, Anchises, with him, and took also by his side his young son, Ascanius. Now, it just so happens that Aeneas, one of the reasons that he survived all those many battles at Troy is because he had a divine mom. His mom was Venus. So, of course, what that means is that two of the progenitors of the Roman line have divine parentage. One derives from Venus and the other derives from Mars. So Aeneas and his dad Anchises and his son Ascanius, sorry about the fact that all their names begin with A, but it doesn't really, the only one you really need to remember is Aeneas, eventually make their way to the shores of Italy, where Aeneas pulls up in this town called Alba Longa, and the king there is so impressed with him that he weds his daughter to Aeneas, and then Aeneas and his wife go on to be king and produce a line of kings, the last one of which is the guy whose daughter bears Romulus and Remus. So what the Romans do is hook a story about a Trojan warrior onto the front end of the Romulus and Remus story. And that collapses or sort of combines both stories into one. And throughout the rest of Roman history, whenever they were making representations of their fantastic beginnings, frequently the stories would be combined together, as in this relief where you've got down here at the bottom the wolf and Romulus and Remus nestled near the Tiber. This is the river Tiber, personified as an old guy in a toga. And here's Aeneas and his son Ascanius up on top. So everything gets collapsed all into one story. All right. So Aeneas becomes a king. He and his wife have a line of kids who are kings. And Romulus and Remus, they, when they move to Rome itself, are kings. And Romulus bears children who grow up to be kings. And in the Roman understanding of their history, they were ruled by kings from April 21st, 753, until the folks who lived in this area took matters into their own hands and overthrew the kings to found a government that was more or less of the people, by the people, for the people, which they called the Republic. And they had a date for this, too. And the date is 509 BCE. What century is this? Good. Yes. Now, if you have a king, then you have a settlement with a single most important building in which many of the all the functions that a settlement needs are combined into one. A building like a megaron or like Unit 41 at Nicoria, sort of big house. If you don't have a king, what sort of building do you have? Zagora, Ephesus. A community building, and what were those community buildings at Zagora and Ephesus? Shrines. They were shrines. On the smallest and the highest of the hills by the river, the Capitoline, in the 6th century BCE, was constructed an enormous temple that, once built, was maintained throughout the life of the Republic and then the Empire, and was the largest and most important of all of the buildings ever built in Rome. And it was the temple of Jupiter, the Roman version of Zeus. Jupiter, the best and the biggest, which sounds great in Latin, Jupiter Optimus Maximus. And because the hill that it was on is the Capitoline, frequently the temple itself is called the Capitolium. And this, of course, is where we get our capital, the name Capitol, from the Capitoline Hill in Rome. And that makes it very easy for you always to remember the difference between capital with an O and capital with an A, because capital with an O is the building, like the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. That's spelled with an O, because it comes from this, the Capitoline in Rome. All right, so what you're looking at here are foundations that have been discovered on the Capitoline Hill in Rome, dating indeed to the century in which the Romans believed they had established the Roman Republic, that century being the 6th century. And you see, here's one corner of the foundations, and here's a huge fragment of wall. The Temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, the Capitolium, was very, very large. It was the podium itself was 175 by 204 feet. It had 3 cellas, C-E-L-L-A-S, 3 cellas, three rooms for 3 deities worshipped inside here, columns along the sides, and a deep porch on the front with 3 rows of columns, and huge steps leading up to it. So it sat up on this high podium, and then these columns rose up. The columns were 8 feet in diameter. So really substantial. And, I see here I did not convert from feet to meters. 17 meters high, so about 36, 37 feet high. Yeah, so pretty large. And found around the outskirts of the foundations in early excavations were terracotta, that is to say clay, decorated plaques. And they show various things, usually processions. Here's a horse and here's a winged horse. So this is sort of divine procession. And the plaques, which are no necessarily great shakes artistically, are a kind of signal that what we have here is a public building. So special care was taken. And here you see a model of the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the top of the Capitoline. From the 6th and the 5th and the 4th centuries BC, you have to just pretend that all of the rest of this stuff is not here. Lots of other stuff gets built up there later, but originally there's just the one gigantic temple with the altar in front of it. All right. So we've got a settlement up here and a temple built up here. And in the same century that the temple is built up on the Capitoline, so in the 6th, the cemetery in this area here is drained. The area, this marshy area, is drained, and the cemetery goes out of use. And the drain is designed to keep the area dry and protect it so that buildings can be put there. And the drain, everything sounds so much better in Latin, doesn't it? So instead of calling it the big drain, we call it the Cloaca Maxima, which means big drain, or biggest drain in Latin, and is the name of the sewer, essentially, which is built through the Forum, putting the cemetery out of use and draining all the way down to the Tiber. And it actually, parts of it still function today. And here you see a functioning part of the Cloaca Maxima, built out of these huge stones of local limestone. And that marshy space in between the Palatine and the Capitoline and the Esquiline Hills that had been a cemetery down until the 6th century BCE and is drained is the area that becomes the seat of the locus for the government of the Republic of Rome, the Roman Republic. And that area is called the Forum. This is the way the Forum looks today. And in the 5th and 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, this is the way it looked. So here's the Capitoline Hill. Here's the Capitolium, the Temple of Jupiter. The Palatine is about here. So this is a view, actually, you guys are all on the Palatine looking down at the Forum. And here you see this open space, the open space of the Forum, surrounded by civic structures, civic buildings. Now, when the Romans overthrew the monarchy and replaced it with a new constitution, a newly devised constitution, it was pretty complicated. It was a pretty complicated affair. As anybody who has studied modern American history may remember from your whatever grade that is that you guys study that stuff in anymore. We studied it in 10th. People still study American history and the development of American government in high school anymore around here? I didn't go to high school in Minnesota. I don't know. Well, it's complicated. Let's just say it's complicated. I'm going to quite briefly tell you what the 3 constituent parts are of the government of the Roman Republic, but let me say that on the course website, I have put a very, very cool and helpful link to a site that will tell you what you need to know about Rome and Roman government and so on and so forth. So if you go to the course website and you go to helpful site and subject links, and then you go to Greek and Roman archaeology, you will see about 2/3 of the way down the page a link to a site called The Romans. And that is very good, and I encourage you to go there to learn more about this. Well, the first thing was Somebody needs to be in charge. But the Romans didn't want to have one person in charge, because one person in charge is too much like a king, and they'd just gotten rid of kings. They didn't want to be ruled by kings any longer. So they invented an office, the highest possible office, and it was called a consul, C-O-N-S-U-L. And there were always two of them. They were appointed annually. They were charged with supreme authority in all affairs, civil and military, but their primary function, especially in the first 300 to 400 years of the Republic, was to lead armies. The consuls were, in effect, the generals, and each one led an army on what comes to be a kind of never-ending series of campaigns. Who appoints the consuls? Where do they come from? The consuls are appointed by the Senate. The Senate is a nice name for all of the guys with connections and wealth. They are the equivalent in Rome of the Pentacosio Medimnoi in Athens. So they have at least 100,000 denarii of land, which is a bunch of land. And one can, just as the Pentacosio Medimnoi in Greece, in Athens, were the people who could produce the most grain every year, 730 bushels, 500 medimnoi. So here also in Rome, the highest class were people who owned a lot of land and could produce surplus. And this group of people, the Senate, once they were members for life, and they had the role of advising the consuls and consenting to laws that were passed by the people, who in Latin is an assembly. An assembly is a comitium. And there were several assemblies, so they were comitia, because there were several. That's the plural of commission, is comitia. So this is, with just one tiny little modification, where we get our system as well. So this is the House of Representatives, this is the Senate, and the tiny little modification is that our consul is singular and we call him a president. So there is executive authority and legislative authority. And in the system here, the judiciary was not a separate system, but was folded into some aspects of the commission and some aspects of the Senate. So that's just swell as an idea, but these people need a place to practice their civic duties. And the place that the Senate practiced its civic duties was in a Senate House, which we sadly do not have anymore, the Republican Senate House. But I tell you all of this because in a few weeks when we get back to Rome and we get to those fun-loving guys, Julius Caesar and his son Augustus and all of those, all of this is going to come back, and we're going to get a Senate building that shows up. So, but there has been a Senate building all along. We just don't have it any longer extant in the Roman Forum. All right. So this little structure right here was the Senate building, and this here, this circular place, is the area for the legislative assembly of the early Romans, the commission. Now, as you can see from these drawings and these plans, we basically don't have any of this anymore in the Forum. The Roman Forum has been built up and built up and built over. But an intact commission was found at a site in southern Italy, Paestum, which was a Republican colony. And this is from the 3rd century BC. And what little fragments have been excavated in Rome and what references we have from Roman authors let us know that the Comitium in Paestum, and ones have been found in other Roman towns as well, this is just the most photogenic one, are very similar to what existed in Rome. So here you have the meeting place for the legislative assembly of the people. And this might not look big enough to you for all the people. If the Senate has the role of advise and consent, but what they consent to is the legislative dicta of the popular assembly, you might get the sense from the remains as we have it that that structure, which sounds very elevated and very noble and very fair, didn't necessarily work out quite like that in reality. I mean, at least our House of Representatives at both the state level and national level is sizable. You can, if you would have to reconstruct how close our Constitution maps onto the reality of what we do, at least you would have the structures that would go with it. But here in Rome, the official meeting place for the people looks, I don't know, more like a clubhouse. But there it is, the Comitium. And in Rome, in the excavations around the ancient Comitium in Rome, fragments of terracotta plaques, again, warriors. This is a horse and a rider, and he's carrying a shield. Tells us that this is a public space, and it was decorated, and it was elaborated. Down here in the area of the Forum, very, very close to the Comitium, was kind of a shrine that the Romans maintained that was very, very important to them. It was a sacred spot, and it was surrounded by a temenos wall, this sacred spot. It's what you do when you've got an old thing that's very special that you want to demarcate, like Grave Circle A at Mycenae. You build a wall around it, and you set it off. And that's what this was. And there was a black stone paving over, covering the ground inside this little structure. And black stone in Latin is lapis niger. Lapis is stone, niger is black. So black stone, and that's what it was called, the Black Stone. And it was this important spot that was demarcated, like I say, right next to the Commission. In 1899, an Italian archaeologist excavated beneath the lapis niger and found this totally wacky thing. One of the earliest Latin inscriptions that exist. And as you can see, Latin is written by using the Greek alphabet. The Romans got their alphabet from the Greeks, who in turn had gotten their alphabet from the Phoenicians. And here's this nutty inscription. Whosoever defiles the spot, let him be forfeit to the spirits of the underworld. Whosoever contaminates it with refuse after due process of law, it shall be proper for the king to deprive him of his property. And whatsoever persons the king shall discover passing on this road, let him bid the herald seize the reins of their draft animals, to force them to turn aside forthwith to take the approved detour. You really have to wonder why this had to get incised on stone. And whosoever shall fail to take the approved detour and shall persist in traveling this road, let him after due process of law be sold to auction to the highest bidder. Whatever. Okay. There's no need to go into any of the details about this crazy thing. You have a question? This was found under it? Yeah, it was found underneath the lapis niger. This inscribed piece of stone. But what's really interesting about this is that it mentions in two places a king, which is some objective documentation in support of the Roman legend that originally they were ruled by kings. And the fact that it's the spot that's sacred and not the inscription itself, since the inscription was buried by being paved over by this stone, is reminiscent of the way in which the Romans cared about their tradition, but changed the way that they ran themselves. So they carefully made the spot into a shrine, but covered up the inscription that talks about kings. Now, the Romans themselves completely lost track of what this was. So it was an important and sacred spot to them, the lapis niger, but they were never really 100% sure why. And there were a lot of stories. So one story is that this was the place where Remus killed Romulus, and Romulus was buried. This was, according to some authors, the burial spot of Romulus. And there were other stories that arose, but the real point is, for the Romans, what was important about this was not specifically what it commemorated, but that it stood for the longevity of their dominion in this spot. The Romans did not repudiate the years in which they believed they were ruled by kings. The traditional founding date of Rome, April 21st, 753 BCE, that's when Rome starts. For the first couple of hundred years, it's ruled by kings. Then the kings are overthrown and the Republic starts in 509. But if you start thinking, when does Rome start? That's its birthday, 753 BCE. When the Romans count back, that's what they get to. And what this spot does is reinforce their sense of pride in the duration of their hegemony here. Not the Republic per se, but just themselves. And that sense is reinforced by two other remains that continued to stand in the city down through the life of the Republic and into the empire. In the Forum, there was a bronze statue of what was called the Capitoline wolf, the wolf who had nursed Romulus and Remus. This statue, which was actually found in Rome, was until very, very recently, as in last year. I mean, every year up until this year, I've actually taught this as the statue that stood in the Forum, and that's what everybody has always thought up until last year. But some high-tech bronze casting analysis experiments done by two European scholars have now decided that this is actually a Renaissance sculpture. We've always known that the kids beneath were an addition. They're not original. We knew that they were added in about the 16th century. But now it actually appears as if the Capitoline wolf. You will see. I tell you all this because you'll find this in reading. You'll find this referred to, this bronze sculpture of a nursing wolf. But even if this is not the exact Capitoline wolf that stood in the Forum, even down into the period of the Republic, something very much like this did stand in the Forum, a statue near the Lapis Niger. And up on the Palatine, there stood the house of Romulus, a hut maintained for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, called the Casa Romuli, which sounds like a restaurant. So, in addition to the veneration of the past qua past, the time depth of the Romans what do these various remains, the Capitolium, the Comitium, the Capitoline Wolf, the hut of Romulus, tell us about what the Romans valued? And in order to help you think about this, let me just point out, we have a lot of stories. Right? We have a lot of stories. We have, let's try this as an experiment. We've got the Mayflower, George Washington and the cherry tree, George Washington and the winter at Valley Forge, Paul Revere and his famous ride, Lincoln's boyhood. What are some of the characteristics that we think of as part of our national character that these stories reify, that these stories reflect? You may chat quickly. Rouse yourselves. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. What'd you say?
Legacy.
Oh, legacy of what?
Like their leaders and how they govern everything.
First answer the American question. Is that the American question? Okay, so what's a quality that we imagine as part of American character, based when you think about all of those stories?
Well, I was just thinking that like the hut thing, that kind of reminded me of the ape thing that you were talking about.
And so, what's the quality? What's the characteristic? Besides that, so all of these are stories from the past. Our stories, the Mayflower, Valley Forge, George Washington and the cherry tree. They're stories about things that happen. But we tell stories, and everybody has always told stories for a reason. And some stories last and continue to be told for a reason. And stories about moments of our or their past, the ones that last, the ones that get repeated, do so because they encode some lesson, some moral, some feature, some character that we say, yeah, that's us. So I'm looking for, what are those features? What are the features for our stories? What are the features for our stories? Tell me one.
Kind of relate to like having pride in like where like we come from.
And what story reflects that?
Like some of the stories about like the independence.
Pride in where we come from. Which of the what story? What specific story encodes that? We are talking. When you said where we come from, what did you mean? The origins of our country. The origins of us, or the origins of our country? So which story? Okay, so we're proud of that. I mean, we know that we have this whole set of stories, and I mean, historically, I don't mean to say they're not true, but aspects of the Revolutionary War, for example. But we count our story well before that. Where was somebody in the middle there who? Okay, humility, that's a characteristic, humility. And the Abe Lincoln story is, is boyhood and so forth. That is one aspect. Another characteristic. Charisma. What's the story?
Well, I think it just relates that all the leaders that we have stories about always had some sort of quality that drew people to them.
But so what's the... You have to connect specifically why that story, what does that story give us?
Is it kind of like the Mayflower, like in Pilgrims from England?
So what's the moral? Maybe this is a better. What's the moral of the story? So what's the moral of the Mayflower story? What's the big lesson? They were escaping persecution, right? They were after freedom. So freedom. No king. They didn't want to have a king be in charge of them, right? They didn't want to have this old system. So we are linked to England, but we are different than them because we will break out. We will not live in this constrained traditional way. Each person will be able to be free. That's the moral of the story, which is why in the United States Capitol dome there's a big relief, and that's where our story starts. Other morals.
The people portrayed in those stories they're not portrayed as like demigods like a lot of other stories, even like Romulus and Remus having gods or goddesses for parents. But, American stories portray them as like kind of like the average person, just they do things that, like they aren't born of a, godlike heritage, they just do things with their life, and that's what makes them great.
It's so there's individual accomplishment that as at a human scale, and people can start small, like Lincoln, but poor, and still achieve. Somebody down here said charisma. What about the Valley Forge story? What are some of the? Why does that story matter?
Bravery and persistence.
Persistence and bravery, willingness to stand up to a foe, willingness to fight. And Washington himself, how does he rally his troops in this horrible winter where they don't have any shoes? That's human, but personal charisma. All right, the Romans. What are characteristics that the Romans would have thought about themselves when they would go up to the Capitolium, see the house of Romulus, see the Capitoline wolf, admire the decorated area of the Commission down here in this the zone of the Forum? Growth. That they expanded, that they had started small and poor, and now were powerful and had the buildings to reflect it. What else? Pride in their tradition. What tradition would that be?
It's like kind of Romulus hordes. Kind of persevered for everything.
You know, the Romans did not think about this as, oh, the twins managed this on their own. Why? What would be the explanation? I mean, these are babies. What did you say? A God protected them. They are chosen. They are protected. They have divine protection. In the back there.
Respect those you kill.
And what's the story?
Well, when one brother killed the other, there's still the reverence for the brother that was killed, and he had remorse for the brother that was killed.
Oh, Romulus does, after he slays Remus. Well, yes, in some Roman stories he did. You don't actually, I mean, there no house of Remus comes down.
In the statue, they still have both brothers, so
You know, yeah, you know what? In the statue in the Forum, actually, there's the wolf. The statue that we have reference to in the Forum refers only to the wolf, not to the kids. The kids are almost certainly not shown in that statue. And these kids are I tried to figure out how I could Photoshop these out, but it was late at night and it got too complicated beyond my Photoshop skills. So I would have liked to remove them so as not to confuse you, but I didn't. So the kids wouldn't have shown up in that case. Although it's true that they both show up on the coins. They're both there on the coins. But a grown-up Remus, we never hear about him.
But that continues on because whenever the Romans would defeat a great enemy, they built these monuments to their victory.
Not in these years.
But later on, so they do show that it's a similar thing of remembering the fall. You are right. You hold on to that, and when we get to Trajan's column in mid-November, I'm going to get back to you. But that's another 700 years, so we just have a little bit of ground to cover between now and then. They're not so much interested in glorifying their enemies at this point. At this point, it's more all about them. So, other characteristics of the Romans. Another characteristic of the Romans. Oh, you just got lucky. Go on. What's the story? Which is the... No, I want you to look at one of the specific things. So the Capitolium, this hut, this wolf, the comitium. So, all right, but there's no empire yet. There's no empire yet. We're in Rome. It's just Rome. Okay, it's just Rome. No, really. I mean, in the 4th century BCE, it's just Rome. But these things are already there. Now, what would you look at specifically with the things on the screen to compare, to make that point?
For greatness, you can look at the two twins hidden from.
Well, the twins aren't but in terms of the buildings that we have in Rome, what would you look at? What would you use to compare?
There's still, like, she does have a point, though. There's a big difference between the original hut and then the big temple of Jupiter.
So that would be a set of specifics that you would look at. You would say, a Roman could say, we started here. Look, this hut is still on the Palatine. Why leave it? It's little, it's old, it's run down, it takes maintenance, it's made of small materials. Who cares? But if you don't have it, then this doesn't look as impressive. If you go from here to here, and you have the story, 753, 509, then you have proof right before your eyes of how you've grown, prospered, and the favor that the gods have bestowed upon you. Other characteristics. What about this space?
They must not have cared too much about the cemetery because they just drained it and built right over it.
Right. They replaced the cemetery with this space. And this space is functionally what? What's the equivalent for us today? Yeah, the National Mall in Washington, D.C. Set aside public space, sanctified space, with markers in it of how long Romans have been here, with the lapis niger and with the Capitoline wolf, early traditions, and present accomplishments, present institutions, the Comitium, the Senate, down here in the area close to the shrine showing favor from the gods. This layout, this setup, settlements on houses on the hills, one hill devoted entirely to the god, and then common civic space. That is a setup that for any Roman entering in this area would reify for them the reality of their system. You know, have you heard of the Law Code of Hammurabi? The Law Code of Hammurabi, yes, the earliest legal code that we have. Scholars of the ancient Near East who study that are divided. They cannot figure out if the Law Code of Hammurabi was descriptive or prescriptive, which is to say, did it describe a functioning set of laws, or was it kind of a wish list? This is the way it should be. If you have a text or a tradition of a governmental system of some sort, how do you know that it actually worked? There's no evidence that can be recovered from ancient Babylon in the 18th century BCE when the Law Code of Hammurabi was written that allows us on the ground to decide. We have a constitution. In 4,000 years, when somebody is as far removed from our constitution as we are from the Law Code of Hammurabi, how will somebody know that it was real? The words alone are not enough. You need the structures. You need to know that these people made a place for government. And that's what the Forum tells us. Draining this area, covering up the cemetery, building these buildings out of stone, not mud, brick, and thatch, with decoration, tells us these were public spaces that mattered. It really is kind of uncanny how familiar some of the stories and aspects that the Romans valued and promulgated reflect in our time. We looked at this reverse of a Lincoln penny last time. This is another one. Both of these are 2009 issues. There's a whole new Lincoln Penny series. Did you know this? There's a whole new Lincoln Penny series coming from the Mint this year, and there are bunches of different reverses. The obverse is all the same, of course. It's always Lincoln. And it's a nice reminder that we need, or many people think we need, or many people still value, these stories that remind us that everything else aside, we have a common past whose characteristics still matter to us. Individual achievement, humility, etc. So the Romans, too, issued coins regularly in the period of the Republic, over the hundreds of years of the Republic, and coins tell us what they thought mattered and how they saw themselves. So on the reverse of many coins, you see the wolf with the twins. But on many coins, you see a battle, two warriors in a battle. Here's the Roman on horseback with his round shield, and he and his horse are trampling over this. So, with all due respect, that's not so. That's more about yay us than yes, this is a valiant foe, and it was a hard, good fight. And this is the goddess of victory, and she's holding a laurel branch, which is the sign of victory. And in every case, you see also Rome herself, Roma, a made-up deity that the Romans took very seriously and was the symbol of Rome. And this symbol of Rome has what on her head? Somebody in the back there, what is that? What is it? Yes. Why? Why does this lady have a helmet on her head? Why does this lady have a helmet on her head? To signify strength, to signify, what's a helmet for? Protection, strength. Can't you just, why does it have to be a helmet? This shows the Romans ready to fight. The personification of Rome is a warrior deity. A city with that kind of attitude needs some protection, and the Romans had that protection. In various places around the modern city of Rome, here near the Aventine, up here near the Quirinal, over here on the other side of the Quirinal, near the river, are these little bits of fragments of wall, defensive wall, which has been found circling the city of Rome. The wall was thought by the Romans to have been built by one of their kings, a king whose name was Servius Tullius. The Romans really crack me up. I understand. They're so cute. They're so earnest. Okay, so the Romans really thought that this wall had been built by this king, and so they called it the Servian Wall after the name of this king. But we know on the basis of the kind of stone that is used in the wall that it could not have been built prior to the 4th century BCE. In other words, the Romans put the Capitolium up here before they encircled their city with a wall, probably because they didn't think they needed a wall. until in the year 390, in the very beginning of the 4th century, the city was sacked by a horde of marauding Gauls from the north. And that was a giant wake-up call to the Romans, and they promptly set about building this huge, huge wall, which has a circuit of 11 kilometers and is a real masterpiece of construction. Here's the biggest intact piece of the Servian wall, which is by the Termini, the train station on the outskirts of downtown Rome. Every block of the wall is the same size. Each block is 177 by 59 by 59 centimeters, so they're quite hefty. They're made out of a kind of limestone that was quarried in an adjacent town, and the kind of stone is called tufa, T-U-F-A. So this 11-kilometer long circuit extends all the way around all 7 of the hills. Mostly it goes along the tops of the hills in order to use the hills themselves as part of the defensive system of the city. Once walled, Rome, whose territory in the year 500 when the Capitolium built is really, greater Rome. It's just an area around Rome, but not that large. Once walled, over the next 400 years, Rome, the city, expanded to control all of the Italic Peninsula and Sicily and parts of the coast of France and Spain and North Africa. And every one of the battles was led by one of the consuls. And whenever one of the consuls returned triumphant, which was regularly, there was a parade. And the parade was called a triumph. A triumph was a specific civic ceremony that the general who disbanded his troops before entering the walled area of Rome, the general and his troops would lead. And the route was always the same. It starts on the outskirts below the Capitoline, but outside the wall, and enters the city, comes down along the base, the southern part of the Palatine, through a huge open esplanade called the Circus Maximus, which means the biggest circus, which was an area for athletic competitions. So here's the Circus Maximus right here. And then the procession turned and came up between the Palatine and the Esquiline and through the Forum and ended at the top on the Capitoline Hill. The Romans celebrated in the years of the Republic over 150 triumphal processions. And over the course of the 8 centuries of Rome, down into, by the time we get to the end of this course, 360 triumphal processions. A recurrent reminder of pride, triumph, glory, their own. Quite similar in idea to 4th of July parades, or what used to be for a while parades on Veterans Day or VJ Day or that sort of thing. And the triumphs would always end with spoils being given here on the Capitoline to the triad of deities who were enshrined in the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus
on the height of the city. I think, oh yeah. So just to give you a sense of what the route of that triumphal procession would look like today, this is the outskirts of the here's the Tiber, so you can see the route of the Tiber in the city of Rome. There's the front end of Tiber Island, or no, I'm sorry, there's Tiber Island right there, and coming through the Circus Maximus around the Palatine. You have to ignore the Colosseum, which is not there yet, and then up through the Forum, and then up to the top of the Capitolium. So quite the triumphal route.
Where's the wall on this map?
Where is the wall on this map? Let's see. The wall goes from. Let's see. Here's the Aventine down here. So the wall actually starts down here, and goes around like this. Is the Viminal, the Esquiline. Goes like this. So it's big. Yeah, very, very big. Okay. I have 2 minutes, but I think I will not start Persepolis. I think I will let you go, and we'll see you on Thursday.